Welcome, dear listener. Tonight we will travel to Mu. What if one of the biggest continents of all time is not missing from your map because it sank, but because it never existed in the first place? Tonight we're sailing out into that blank space on the globe, into the imagined world of Mu, the legendary lost motherland that scholars misread into being and storytellers refuse to let die. If this cozy story helps you drift off, please subscribe, tap like, and leave a gentle comment. Your support keeps the journey continues. Imagine it is late and quiet. Your room is dim except for a small lamp, and on the bedside table there is a large paper map of the world. Your finger drifts lazily over the familiar shapes of the continents, then out into the open blue of the Pacific Ocean. There is so much space there, so much calm, empty colour. It feels almost rude that the map insists nothing large sits in all that water. Your sleepy mind starts to wonder whether people ever tried to put something there. A missing island, perhaps. Or if you stay up too late reading strange books, an entire lost continent with a very short name. The story of Mu begins in this kind of mental twilight, somewhere between scholarship and dream. In the 19th century, long before anyone spoke confidently about plate tectonics and drifting continents, many naturalists and philosophers were trying to explain curious patterns in the world. Similar animals and plants appeared on coasts that were now far apart. Myths from different regions seemed to echo one another. To make sense of these puzzles, some thinkers proposed bridges of land that had once connected the continents, and others suggested whole continents had risen and sunk again in deep time. Lemuria, a hypothetical land in the Indian Ocean invented to explain the spread of lemur fossils, is a famous example of this way of thinking, later adopted by occult writers who turned it into a mystical homeland. Within this atmosphere, the Pacific and the Atlantic were not just bodies of water, they were stages that could host vanished worlds. When a 19th century scholar looked at an old map, the wide blue spaces did not feel as final as they do to us. The deep ocean floor was still a mystery. A missing continent there still seemed at least possible. It was a time when scientific speculation, romantic imagination, and spiritual longing were all happy to share the same desk. If you picture that desk, you might see a globe, a cup of cooling tea, a pile of letters, and perhaps a well-thumbed volume about Plato's Atlantis, sitting just within reach. Into this world steps a French priest and scholar with a very long name and a very active imagination, Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg. He devoted much of his life to studying the civilizations of Mesoamerica, collecting manuscripts and trying to understand the hieroglyphic writing of the Maya. In the 1860s he examined what was then called the Troano Codex, one of the few surviving Maya screenfold books. Using an imperfect alphabet created earlier by Bishop Diego de Landa, Brasseur tried to decipher the mysterious signs. In the process, he produced a translation that later scholars would consider highly unreliable, but at the time it felt like opening a door into an unknown past. Brasseur believed he could see in the codex a record of great cataclysms and a reference to a land named Mu that had been destroyed by water and fire. The codex does not actually say this, at least not in any way modern specialists accept, but the idea stuck in his mind. He was already intrigued by the legend of Atlantis, and he began to link this supposed Mu to the broader fascination with drowned lands. In his writings, he suggested that ancient American texts might preserve memories of a vanished continent, a place whose loss had shaped later cultures. It was only a passing suggestion, a glimmer more than a fully mapped world, yet that single syllable, Mu, was now floating between his pages and the blank ocean traces on so many maps. Picture Brasseur in his study on a winter evening. The fire is low, and the light comes from oil lamps that give everything a soft amber glow. The Troano Codex lies open on the table, its long accordion folds covered in red, black and blue designs. Around him stand shelves of Spanish and Latin chronicles, paper rustling quietly whenever he turns from one to another. He frowns, then smiles, then underlines another passage in his notes. Outside, the streets are dark and wet. Inside, on the thin bark pages of an old Maya book, a lost land with a short name begins to take shape. It is not yet the Mu of later writers, but the seed has been planted. Brasseur's work did not convince professional linguists, and later Mayanists considered his translations fanciful. Yet his ideas spread among a small but eager audience of explorers, mystics, and amateur historians. One of those readers was Augustus Le Plongeon, a British-born photographer and self-taught archaeologist who spent many years working among the ruins of Yucatan in the late 19th century. He and his wife Alice documented Maya sites with great energy, producing detailed photographs and drawings. At the same time, he developed bold theories about the antiquity and influence of Maya civilization, arguing that it was older than Egypt or Greece, and that its people had given rise to many later cultures. Le Plongeon took Brasseur's Mu and made it something larger and more dramatic. He claimed that the Maya texts he studied told the story of a powerful queen named Mu and her consort Prince Ko, whose lives and fates were reflected in the later Egyptian myths of Isis and Osiris. From this imaginative reading, he argued that a great civilization had flourished in the Americas, and that refugees from a catastrophic event had sailed across the ocean to found ancient Egypt. In his view, the land of Mu was both the stage for this lost drama and the original home of peoples who later appeared around the world. The Atlantic, rather than the Pacific, was his chosen setting for this vanished realm, linking Mu closely with the popular legend of Atlantis. If Brasseur's study felt like a quiet clerical room, Le Plongeon's world was hotter and louder. Imagine him at a camp table near a Maya pyramid, the night alive with insects and distant animal calls, a lantern throwing his papers into sharp relief. Fragments of carved stone are stacked nearby, along with measuring rods and camera equipment. He moves between the ruins themselves, where bats circle above the dark temple doorways, and his notebooks, where he tries to fit everything into a grand story. The contrast is striking, real stones under his hands, and in his mind a vast narrative that stretches from Yucatan to Egypt to a whole continent that no longer exists. It is the sort of leap you might attempt yourself if you spent too long under a tropical sun with only myths and ruins for company. Le Plongeon published his ideas in books and lectures, but mainstream archaeologists remained unconvinced. His supposed readings of Maya inscriptions did not match the slowly improving scholarly understanding of the script. His sweeping claims about migrations and mother civilizations seemed to rest more on intuition than on evidence. Still, his writings reached readers already enchanted by Ignatius Donnelly's earlier work on Atlantis, and by the general trend that liked to imagine a single origin point for all ancient wisdom. In that mood, the land of Mu, tied to both America and Atlantis, sounded like a wonderful missing piece. Even if the puzzle box had been bought without instructions, it is important to remember the scientific context. In Le Plongeon's day, the idea of continents rising and sinking on a grand scale was not yet ruled out by detailed knowledge of the ocean floor. Soundings had begun, but the crisp maps of undersea ridges and trenches that we take for granted did not yet exist. Earth history was hazy, and the notion that a continent could once have stood where there was now only deep water did not feel absurd. When people looked at a globe, they saw room for lost lands, and their minds happily filled that room with stories. If geology left some spaces open, imagination was more than ready to move in with trunks and furniture. By the end of the 19th century, the name Mu had passed from Brasseur's scattered hints, through Le Plongeon's ambitious reconstructions, into a wider stream of speculative writing. It was still a shadowy idea, less famous than Atlantis, less developed than Lemuria, yet it lingered. The important point is that Mu did not come from ancient maps or secret stone tablets. It emerged from a chain of misreadings and creative interpretations by very human scholars, each working with incomplete tools and large hopes. That does not make the story worthless. In a way, it makes it more revealing because it shows how easily we project our own desires and patterns onto the silence of the past. So you find yourself back in your bedroom, the map on the bedside table, the Pacific shining quietly under the lamplight. You know now that the name Mu did not drift up from the waves but rose instead from the pages of a misunderstood codex and the notebooks of a determined photographer. You can almost see them when you close your eyes. Brasseur bending over his Maya manuscript, Le Plongeon gazing at a pyramid and imagining ships sailing toward Egypt, both men reaching for a lost land that would make everything connect. The ocean on your map remains blank, at least in geographical terms, but it feels a little more crowded with stories. As you let your eyes grow heavy, that wide blue space becomes less an empty gap and more a calm canvas where the minds of past dreamers once painted a continent named Mu. Imagine another late night, but now the map on the bedside table has changed. The first map showed only the soft blue of the Pacific, all ocean and no land. Now there is a different sheet of paper under the lamplight. Someone has drawn a huge pale shape across that same blue, stretching from near Hawaii to the region of Easter Island, and from the Marianas down toward the South Pacific. In careful ink, a tidy label sits across the shape. Mu, the motherland of men. This is the world of James Churchward. He was a British-born engineer and former soldier who spent much of his life in the wider world, from India to the United States. In the years after the First World War, he retired from active work, but not from thinking. He had a restless curiosity, the sort that is always reaching for a grand pattern behind scattered facts. In the 1920s, he began to publish a series of books about a lost Pacific continent that he called Mu, a place he believed to be the original homeland of humanity. Churchward liked to begin his story far from the Pacific. He told readers that decades earlier, while serving in India, he had befriended a learned temple priest. This priest, he said, showed him a set of ancient clay tablets written in a forgotten script. The tablets were fragile and sun-baked, almost crumbling to dust. Only a few people in the world, so the story went, could read the language engraved on them. Churchward claimed that he persuaded the priest to teach him this dead tongue, reminding him that his training as an engineer meant he could help preserve the tablets. It sounds almost like the start of an adventure novel, with a secret archive and a chosen outsider, except that in his version the adventure ends not with treasure, but with long evenings of translation. In those translations, Churchward said, he found the story of a vast land in the Pacific Ocean, a continent where humankind had first appeared. He called the people of this land the Narkal, a wise and spiritual civilization guided by a high priesthood and a single overarching faith. In his telling, Mu was not just another bit of geography. It was the stage for the entire first act of human history. Cities rose there, gleaming in clean air under a gentle sun. Skilled architects built temples, observatories, and long avenues. Vast farmlands stretched inland from the coast, laced with the rivers and canals. At its height, Churchward wrote, Mu was home to tens of millions of people and 7 great cities, a kind of world heart that sent its lifeblood out in all directions. If you picture Churchward at his desk as he shaped this vision, the scene is almost cosy. A heavy oak tabletop, a bottle of ink, its glass chipped at the rim, a sharpened dip pen lying beside a ruler and a pair of compasses, stacks of notes from earlier years held together with tired ribbon, a big blank map of the Pacific spread out and waiting. Outside, a city hums faintly. Inside, the only sounds are the scratch of the pen, the rustle of paper, and perhaps the faint clink of a teacup. The continent of Mu is not rising from the sea. It is forming out of lines of handwriting and the stubborn belief that the world we know must have a hidden beginning. Churchward published the first of his Mu books in the 1920s under the title The Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Men. Later editions shortened the title, but the idea remained the same. He followed this with volumes on the children of Mu and the sacred symbols of Mu, among others. Taken together, these books laid out a sweeping narrative in which all the major civilizations of the world traced their roots back to Mu. Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, the cultures of the Americas, even the builders of mysterious stoneworks in the Pacific, all were presented as branches of this one deep-rooted tree. In order to make that claim feel solid, Churchward needed evidence, or at least something that could pass for it in the half-light between scholarship and myth. Alongside the Indian tablets of his tale, he drew on a real discovery from Mexico. The archaeologist William Niven had unearthed thousands of carved stone tablets near Mexico City in the early 20th century. Their markings were not understood and remained disputed. Churchward decided that these too were records left by people connected to Mu. He wrote that their symbols, once properly seen, told the same story as his Indian sources. In this way, scattered and puzzling artifacts became supporting characters in his main drama, even if professional archaeologists and linguists did not share his readings. He also searched for patterns in myths, scriptures, and symbols, in solar discs carved over doorways, in feathered birds, in stylized serpents, in crosses and circles from different cultures. He saw echoes of a single original language of symbols. If the sun god of Egypt was called Ra, and the word for sun in distant islands sounded similar, then to him this suggested a shared origin in Mu. Modern linguists would call this a very fragile chain of reasoning, rather like building a bridge out of unrelated jigsaw pieces. But for readers hungry for a unified past, it had a strong emotional pull. In these patterns, Churchward felt he could hear the faint surviving accent of the Motherland, still audible under the local tones of later religions. The shape of Mu itself was described in loving detail. Churchward placed it across the central and western Pacific, larger than South America, but composed mostly of low, fertile plains. It was not a mountainous, jagged land torn by rifts. It was more like a great garden plateau rising gently above the ocean. He wrote that its landmass had been lifted by underground forces, and that its eventual destruction came when the delicate balance of volcanic gases and stone gave way. In a single catastrophic period of earthquakes and eruptions, the entire continent broke apart and sank, leaving only scattered island peaks showing where its highlands had once been. For a sleepy listener, this is a dramatic picture, but the script can linger more on the idea of how easily whole worlds can vanish from memory when their stories are no longer told. Churchward's work appeared at a time when the wider culture was already fascinated by spiritual questions and the possibility of ancient wisdom. Theosophy, an influential spiritual movement, had made much of earlier ideas about another hypothetical continent named Lemuria, presenting its inhabitants as advanced beings on a path of soul evolution. Lost lands were not only geographical guesses, but stages for mystical history, where root races rose, learned, and moved on. Churchward's Mu slotted neatly into this atmosphere. It offered an almost comforting picture. Humanity had a single noble cradle, now gone but not entirely lost, because traces of its greatness survived in the sacred symbols and teachings of many traditions. At the same time, geology and oceanography were quietly changing the map behind his back, as scientists improved soundings of the seafloor and developed the beginnings of plate tectonic theory. The idea of a recent large sunken continent in the middle of an ocean grew steadily weaker. The physical crust under the Pacific turned out to be very different from continental rock, and there was no sign of a vanished landmass the size that Churchward described. Yet for many of his readers, the joy was less in matching the story to hard data, and more in simply inhabiting a grand vision of the past for a few evenings. Even now, plenty of us enjoy stories that we know cannot be literally true, especially when they speak to a wish for unity or purpose. In that sense, Churchward was more a novelist of prehistory than a historian, even if he insisted otherwise. Picture now one of his readers in the 1930s. Perhaps it is someone in a small apartment, with a worn armchair pulled close to a reading lamp. The cover of The Lost Continent of Mu is slightly frayed at the edges. When the reader opens it, the spine creaks and the pages release a faint smell of old paper. Inside are maps, diagrams, strange alphabets, and confident statements about events said to have taken place tens of thousands of years ago. Outside the window, trolley cars rattle past and newsboys shout about economic troubles. Inside, for an hour or two, the reader is far away, wandering through imaginary cities under an eternal sun, believing that all peoples, however scattered, once walk the same streets. It is not scientific, but it is soothing. Churchward himself was firm about the reality of his claims. He presented his work as the product of long investigation, testable by anyone who would look at the evidence with an open mind. Critics, both then and later, pointed out that no one else ever saw the Indian tablets he described, that his versions of Niven's Mexican stones did not match the originals in key ways, and that his linguistic comparisons were wildly untrained. From their perspective, Mu was a house built on sand, or rather, on air. Those who study the history of pseudo-archaeology now often use him as a textbook example of how a single energetic writer can assemble a convincing-sounding myth from thin and unreliable parts. Yet it would be too simple to dismiss the whole thing with a shrug and turn out the light. There is something human and almost tender in Churchward's stubborn attempt to knit the world together. He looked at scattered temples, pyramids, myths, and unknown stones, and he wanted them to be family, not strangers. He wanted a story in which no culture's achievements were purely local accidents, but echoes of a shared beginning. Even if his method was deeply flawed, the feeling behind it is one that many people share. It is the same feeling that makes a person trace their finger across the map at night and wonder where we all truly came from. By the time Churchward died in the 1930s, Mu had become a full-size land in the imagination of certain readers, almost as solid as Atlantis. Later authors would borrow his maps, adjust his timelines, or move his ideas into science fiction and fantasy. Some spiritual movements would treat Mu as a real stage in cosmic history, full of wise teachers and advanced technologies hidden from our official timelines. Others would treat it as an amusing relic of an earlier age of speculation. The continent that never existed, as geologists would politely remind anyone who asked, had nonetheless taken on a kind of paper reality in bookstores and the private libraries around the world. So we end this part where we began, with that lamplit desk and the map of the Pacific. In the glow, the landmass of Mu stretches widely, shaded in as if it could really bear the weight of cities and fields. Around it, the tiny island chains we know today cling to its imagined edges, like crumbs left when a loaf has been removed. To modern eyes trained on satellite images and seafloor charts, the drawing looks impossible. To Churchward and his readers, it looked like a lost home finally found. As you lie back and close your eyes, you can let that impossible map float behind your eyelids for a moment. A quiet continent made of ink and longing, drifting very gently beneath the slow breathing of the Pacific, while the real Earth turns steadily under your window. Tonight the map on your bedside table is different again. No gentle outlines of continents, no imaginary land shaded at the centre of the Pacific. Instead, you have a textbook cross-section of the Earth, bright bands of crust and mantle, arrows showing plates drifting, neat labels that someone wrote in a very determined font. Under the Pacific there is only oceanic crust, dark and dense, crossed by ridges and trenches. It looks busy, but also firm. There is no blank space left where a whole lost continent could hide. In this light, Mu feels less like a missing land and more like a dream you almost remember from another night. Modern geology is, in many ways, the quiet opponent of Mu. Over the 20th century, scientists learned that the outer shell of the Earth is divided into large plates, some carrying continents, others forming the floors of oceans. Continental crust is light and thick. Oceanic crust is heavier, thinner, and continually renewed along mid-ocean ridges as a magma wells up and cools. It does not suddenly vanish. It sinks solely back into the mantle along subduction zones at the edges of oceans. When geologists mapped the Pacific seafloor, they found no trace of a broken continent, only broad plains of basalt and long volcanic island chains. From this point of view, a world-sized landmass like Churchward's Mu simply cannot drop into deep water in a single night. As echo sounding and later sonar surveys traced the undersea landscape, the picture became clearer. Ridges snake along the middle of the oceans. Trenches mark the places where crust bends downward. Sediment layers are thin compared with those on continents, which tells scientists that the ocean floor is geologically young. Most of the Pacific crust is less than 200 million years old, a brief span compared with the age of the continents. There is nowhere for a vanished Mu to be hiding, no older block of land that once rose into the sunlight and then fell again. The seafloor is not a graveyard of drowned continents. It is more like a slow conveyor belt, carrying rock away from ridges and down into the deep. You can imagine a research vessel at sea in the middle decades of the 20th century. It is night, and most of the crew are asleep in narrow bunks. On the bridge a small red lamp glows over charts, and the sea outside is black and restless. Somewhere below, a machine sends steady pings down into the depths and listens for echoes. Thin lines creep across rolls of paper as the profile of the seafloor appears in soft blue pencil. Each new transect shows the same thing. No sudden underwater plateau the size of a continent, no hidden garden world waiting just out of sight. Only slopes, ridges and plains carved by time and currents. If there is a lost land in this scene, it exists only in the minds of people standing warm and dry on the deck thinking of old stories. By the middle of the century, scientists were comfortable saying that Mu and similar ideas were not supported by physical evidence. Geologists pointed out that a continent built of light crust cannot simply sink and disappear in a brief cataclysm, and that the structures of the Pacific floor leave no room for such a land in the recent past. The romantic idea of sunken worlds did not vanish, though. Instead, it moved more fully into the realm of myth, fiction, and what scholars politely call pseudo-archaeology. The shelves of serious libraries made less space for it. The shelves of curious bookshops and private collections did not mind at all. In 1954, the writer L. Sprague de Camp gathered many of these stories together in his book, Lost Continents. He had a dry sense of humour and a taste for careful research. With a patient, sometimes amused tone, he traced the history of Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, and other imagined lands, showing how misread texts and hopeful speculations had grown into confident maps and elaborate chronologies. He devoted chapters to the way Mu began with a mistranslated Maya manuscript, and grew into Churchward's vast Pacific homeland. Above all, he laid out the geological and archaeological reasons for doubting the existence of any such continent. To him, Mu was an illustration of the human will to believe, a kind of case study in how seductive grand theories can be even when evidence runs the other way. You can picture de Camp at his own desk, perhaps with a cat on the radiator and a stack of battered paperbacks beside him. On one side sits a pile of Mu and Atlantis books, full of capitals and exclamation points. On the other side lie geological journals and sober reports from oceanographic surveys. He reads a claim that a whole continent sank overnight. Then he reads the seafloor data that say otherwise, and he smiles the tired smile of someone watching a magician repeat a trick he already knows. Yet he still takes the time to write it all out, knowing that clear explanations are a kind of kindness. They give people something solid to hold on to when myths become confusing. While scientists were closing the door on Mua's geology, others were opening windows to Mua's symbol. One of the most striking examples comes from early Republican Turkey in the 1930s. In that period, some intellectuals and officials were searching for ways to present the Turks as one of the world's most ancient and central peoples. A broad cluster of ideas grew up, linking Turkish identity to very early civilizations. The Sun language theory suggested that all human tongues could be traced back to a Proto-Turkic source. Alongside this, some thinkers, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk himself at times, showed interest in Churchward's proposal that Mu had been the original homeland of humankind. It was tempting to imagine that the Turks too descended from refugees of this noble lost land. These notions never became stable academic consensus, and many Turkish historians and linguists quietly set them aside. Yet for a while they received official encouragement, appeared in language congresses, and filtered into school materials and popular works. Mu in this setting was less a detailed geographical claim, and more a stage for a story about national pride and very deep roots. It shows how easily a myth of a lost continent can intertwine with questions of identity. The same Mu that served as a mystical cradle of humanity in Churchward's books could, in another context, become the imagined birthplace of one particular people. In both cases, the land itself was less important than the longing behind it. As the 20th century went on, Mu appeared in other corners of alternative history. Some writers folded it into spiritual systems that described cycles of root races and cosmic ages. Others connected it to stories of advanced, forgotten technologies, crystal power, or visitors from the stars. These accounts moved freely between Mu, Atlantis, and Lemuria, treating them almost like different neighbourhoods in the same invisible city. For archaeologists and historians, this growing tangle of claims was frustrating because it often ignored real evidence about how and when cultures developed. For many readers, though, the appeal remained the same. A single secret centre of wisdom felt far more satisfying than the slow patchwork story that careful research tends to reveal. In the late 20th century, a new candidate for a fragment of Mu drew attention far from libraries and lecture halls. Off the island of Yonaguni, at the southwestern tip of Japan, divers found a striking underwater rock formation. It lies in clear water, with terraces, sharp steps and flat platforms that look uncannily like carved structures. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura argued that these features were partly artificial, remnants of an ancient complex that had been submerged as sea levels rose. At times he suggested that this might be linked to the legendary continent of Mu, and the site soon gained the nickname Japan's Atlantis. Images of the stepped pyramid at Yonaguni began to appear in documentaries, magazines, and the dreams of anyone who likes the idea of underwater cities, most geologists and archaeologists. However, see Yonaguni as a natural formation, shaped by the way local sandstone fractures along straight lines and by the patient work of waves and currents. They point out that similar stepped patterns appear in other rocky coasts where no one claims ancient builders. They note the lack of clear artefacts that would show sustained human modification. For them, Yonaguni is part of the long list of places where nature has created something that looks man-made at first glance, from the Giant's Causeway in Ireland to certain mesas and cliffs in desert regions. The fact that this particular set of rocks appeared just when television crews were hungry for mysterious content simply helped the legend along. Still, it is easy to see why a diver drifting over those terraces might feel a shiver of wonder. The water is clear and cold. Fish move in quick flashes of silver. The edges of the stone drop away into blue shadow. If your tanks and training allowed it, you might swim along a straight corridor of rock and feel, for a heartbeat, that you are passing through a drowned avenue. In that instant, Mu is not a diagram in a debunking book or a coloured patch on a speculative map. It is a mood, a sense that the world might hold more secrets than the charts admit. Then you rise toward the surface, bubbles sliding upward, and the ordinary sky greets you, unaware of any lost continents. By now, if you look back over the story of Mu, a pattern emerges. At each step where evidence grows stronger, the physical continent retreats. Ocean mapping squeezes it off the seafloor. Plate tectonics denies it the power to vanish overnight. Careful archaeology finds no shared mother civilization behind the independent flowering of cultures in Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, or the Americas. Yet at the same time, Mu thrives as a symbol in nationalism, in spiritual writing, in tourism, flyers for mysterious dive sites, and in late-night conversations. The land melts away, but the feeling remains. Back in your room, the textbook cross-section still lies on the table. You can trace a finger along the arc of a tectonic plate, over the thin band of oceanic crust, down into the mantle where rock flows so slowly that it may as well be still for anyone trying to fall asleep. No Mu is hidden there, at least not as a continent of soil and stone. Instead, there is the very real, very steady story of a planet that recycles its surface over tens of millions of years. Perhaps that story is less dramatic than an overnight cataclysm, but it has its own deep comfort. The ground under your bed is part of a patient dance that has been going on long before anyone spoke of Atlantis or Lemuria or Mu. As your eyes grow heavier, you might remember the first map from earlier parts of this tale, the wide blue Pacific that seemed empty, and the second map with Churchward's graceful continent spread across it. Now you add a third image to the set, a map not of surfaces, but of structures beneath them, ridges and trenches drawn in soft colours. Between these three maps, Mu has moved from possibility to story, from proposed homeland to shared legend. The ocean outside the window remains just water and waves. Yet in your thoughts the sea is layered with the traces of all these ideas, like faint old pencil lines under new ink. You can let those lines blur now, knowing that while the continent of Mu has no place on the real seafloor, the questions and hopes that created it still float gently in the dark, rocking you towards sleep. Tonight the glow in the room is different. No rustling old maps, no stiff textbook diagrams. Instead there is the gentle rectangle of a screen. It might be a television across the room, the soft light of a laptop, or a phone resting on your chest as you slowly lose the battle with gravity. On that screen there could be almost anything. A pulpy adventure, a role-playing game, an animated series, a fan wiki with too many tabs open. What you might not notice at first is how often that little syllable appears in the background. Mu. The continent that never existed has quietly become a busy place in our collective imagination. Once scientists had firmly moved Mu off the real seafloor, writers wasted no time moving it into fiction. The world of strange tales around H.P. Lovecraft and his circle embraced Mu as another stage for cosmic drama. In one story that Lovecraft revised for another writer, a mummy on display in a Boston museum turns out to be a sorcerer from Mu, wrapped not just in bandages, but in a long history of forbidden cults and ancient gods. Later authors in the same mythic universe, people like Lynn Carter, filled in more details, imagining a prehistoric Mu with its own people and its own disasters, a world that echoed Churchward's claims yet tilted them firmly into fantasy. If you picture that museum from the story as a real place, It feels very much like a scene designed to keep you pleasantly awake for a few minutes before sleep. Glass cases gleam under dim lights, polished floors reflect the shapes of tall columns. Somewhere a night guard's footsteps fade down a corridor. In one quiet hall stands the mummy from Mu, or at least a sign that claims as much. Of course, in our world, no such label appears in a real museum, yet the image is lasting. For many readers, Mu became a shorthand for the deep past, a lost chapter that could be reopened whenever a tale needed both grandeur and doom. From there, the continent wandered even further into printed fiction. Writers of light-hearted stories had fun with it. One author produced a spoof account of Muror, supposedly another name for Mu, written under a fake identity that literally spelled out not really when rearranged. The book pretended to be a serious translation of an ancient diary while winking at readers who caught the joke. Comics joined in as well. In the Corto Maltese adventure by Hugo Pratt, for example, the search for Mu becomes an excuse for a dreamlike journey that mixes myth, archaeology, and sheer mood. In superhero universes, Mu can be one of several legendary lands that rise and fall before the main story even begins, swept up in battles of gods and cosmic beings. In all these appearances, Mu is like a reusable set in a theatre. The walls may change paint, the costumes may vary, but the stage name remains the same. As moving images grew more common, Mu followed them onto film and television. In one Japanese science fiction movie from the early 60s, the continent of Mu is not a tragic victim, but an active power, sending war machines from the deep to threaten the surface world until the inevitable clash with a superweapon from above. The sets are full of elaborate control rooms, uniforms, and long echoing hallways, the sort of scenes you might stumble across while flipping through late-night channels. If you happen to half wake to such a film, you might catch a glimpse of a Mu emblem on a wall and wonder if you were still dreaming. Animation and manga added more layers. In some series, Mu is a lost kingdom beneath the sea, ruled by a queen and filled with strange beasts. In others, it is a ceremonial ground where the fate of spirits is decided, or even the name of a mysterious invading race. Japanese popular culture has shown a particular fondness for Mu and similar ideas. There is even a magazine simply titled Mu that focuses on fringe topics and alternative claims about history and the paranormal. A glossy reminder that for many readers the lost continent still feels alive as both speculation and story. By the time video games arrived, Mu was more than ready to be turned into a place you could visit with a controller or keyboard. One role-playing game on a classic home console sends its young hero through an underwater kingdom called Mu, a quiet, ruined place that you must explore and escape. In an online fantasy game, the entire world is openly branded the continent of Mu, a landscape of castles, monsters, and endless quests where players hunt for better armour and rare items, while the original pseudo-scientific sources are only a faint memory in the background. Other games tuck Mu into specific corners. A handheld adventure starring a blue-armoured robot places its final showdown on a floating landmass named Mu, high above the world, full of sleek corridors and humming technology. A spin on a famous sponge, of all things, sends cheerful sea creatures to visit Mu in one version of a game. A series about high schoolers with hidden powers includes Mu as a region, and even names a song after it, letting the continent drift through the soundtrack as well as the scenery. A strategy game about Asian empires hides references to Mu in a few of its ocean treasures, rewarding players who happen to click on the right shining crate with a small pile of extra resources, and a quiet nod to Churchward. Modern mobile games have also borrowed the name. One science fiction action game describes a lost continent of Mu in its backstory, drawing loosely on the idea of an advanced culture that fell long before the main plot. Players may never see a detailed map of this Mu, but the name helps give the setting a sense of depth, as if there are forgotten strata of history hidden beneath each stage. Even for people who have never heard of James Churchward, the word Mu now carries a faint charge of mystery simply from this repeated use. While all this has unfolded in entertainment, Mu has also continued a quieter life in modern spiritual and New Age writing. Some authors treat Churchward almost as a prophet who glimpsed half-remembered truths about earlier ages. They describe Mu as a place of higher consciousness, where people lived in harmony with cosmic energies or with the Earth's subtle fields. In these stories, the fall of Mu is not only a geological event, but a moral or spiritual decline, a warning about losing balance with nature or with inner wisdom. The influence of theosophy still echoes here, even when the word itself is not used. That movement, with its vision of hidden masters and root races rising through cycles of time, had already taught many seekers to look for lost homelands of the soul, not just of the body. In that sense, Mu became one more possible chapter in a long cosmic curriculum. Some modern esoteric writers combine Mu with Lemuria and Atlantis, describing overlapping eras and invisible survivors who supposedly guide humanity from behind the scenes. Others imagine Mu as a more ethereal place from the very beginning, less a continent of rock, and more a plateau of subtle energy that existed alongside our physical world. In East Asia, particularly in Japan, Mu circles through both pop culture and pseudoscientific enthusiasm. The magazine named Mu publishes articles on unexplained phenomena, alternative archaeology, and accounts of ancient advanced societies. One New Age book by a Korean author describes Mu as the first consciousness of the universe, a kind of guiding intelligence that once worked through a society called Lemuria, which is presented as more spiritual than material. In this version, Mu is not so much drowned as diffused, its essence said to live on in the minds of those who awaken to it. If you imagine a quiet New Age bookshop in some city, the picture comes together. The air smells softly of incense and paper. Crystals catch the lamplight on a small wooden shelf. On one side stand books about meditation, energy healing, and distant star families. On another, a set of slim volumes tells of Atlantis, Lemuria, and Mu, their covers decorated with oceans, stars, and temples. A reader sits cross-legged on the floor, flipping through the pages of a Mu book that speaks of high-vibration love and forgotten light cities beneath the sea. Outside, traffic moves, people hurry, news alerts buzz in pockets. Inside, the lost continent offers a slower, kinder origin story, one where everything once started in harmony and could perhaps return to it. Meanwhile, the internet has given Mu 1,000 new lives. Fanwikis catalogue every fictional version of the continent, from the ancient war-torn realm in certain robot sagas to the ceremonial grounds of a shamanic tournament in a manga. In the world of Lovecraft fandom, dedicated pages explore the civilization of the Muvians, complete with invented histories, lists of deities, and speculation on exactly how the place met its many apocalyptic ends. Forums and comment threads bubble with small discoveries. Someone playing an old game posts a message saying they finally reached the lost city of Mu and asks if the designers knew about Churchward. Someone else shares a screenshot from a cartoon where a villain plots from a base named Mu, and a third person replies with a link to a long article debunking the original pseudo-archaeology. Social media posts show maps of Mu traced over satellite views of the Pacific, sometimes sincerely, sometimes with a wink. Instead of a single big book, Mu has become a scattered conversation, a cloud of references that drift from platform to platform. When you step back from all of this, a gentle pattern appears. In the first part of this story, Mu rose from a mistaken reading of the Maya Codex and the dreams of a few 19th century scholars. In the second part, James Churchward turned it into a grand motherland, complete with detailed maps and moral lessons. In the third, geology and archaeology quietly closed the door on Mu as a real continent, while the idea slipped into nationalism, esotericism, and imaginative tourism. Now, in this fourth view, Mu has become a flexible backdrop. Writers use it to stage cosmic horror, airy spirituality, nostalgic adventure, tongue-in-cheek parody, and digital quests. The continent is more crowded than ever, even though it never existed to begin with. Here in your room, the only actual continent present is the one under your bed, a stable patch of crust in a very real tectonic plate. Yet on your shelves and in your devices, Mu can be waiting almost anywhere. It might be the next level in a game, a chapter in an old paperback, a random late-night documentary thumbnail, or a name in an online post that sends you down a pleasing rabbit hole. Each version adds another layer of story over the same empty stretch of ocean. So once more you return in imagination to that bedside map from the first night. Your fingertip moves over Asia, slips out past the islands, and rests on the wide Pacific. In reality, there is only water, wind, and the slow march of waves. In your mind's eye, though, you can feel all the moux that has been poured into this blue space. The scholarly moux of Brasseur and Le Plongeon, the grand moux of Churchward, the debunked moux of geologists, the mystical moux of New Age shelves, the pixelated moux of games and cartoons, the half-serious, half-joking moux of fan discussions. You do not need to believe in any of these as fact to let them keep you company. They are like overlapping constellations drawn on the same patch of night sky. Different cultures connect the stars in different ways. The stars themselves simply shine. In the same way, the Pacific rolls on, indifferent yet generous, giving human minds a canvas large enough to hold continents that never were. As your eyes grow heavy, you can let the syllable mu soften into a simple murmur. A sound like the start of a hum, a reminder that people have always filled the dark with stories, some careful, some wild, many somewhere in between. The lost continent has turned out not to be a land of stone and soil, but a quiet strip of coastline inside the imagination, where history, myth, and fantasy meet and share a small, flickering campfire. You're welcome to sit by that fire for a while longer, or to lie back and let it fade, while the real oceans, and all their visible islands, rock the planet gently beneath your sleeping dreams. And so, our journey for tonight comes to a quiet close. The story lingers, like the last glow of candlelight, as you drift further into rest. If these gentle wanderings bring you peace, I invite you to like and subscribe so that whenever you wish, you may return and we can travel together once more. For now, dear listener, may your dreams be kind and your night be restful. Until next time.